Welcome to McClatchy Newspapers Joint Editorial Board Forum on Proposition 30, the Clean Cars and Clean Air Act, a statewide initiative which would establish a wealth tax to benefit electric vehicles and charging stations in California, as well as efforts to fight wildfires. My name is Garth Stapley, and I am the opinions editor with the Modesto Bee. Joining me are my colleagues Stephanie Finucane and Tad Weber, who are the opinions editors with the San Luis Obispo Tribune and with the Fresno Bee, respectively. We also have Marcos Breton, who is the opinion editor at the Sacramento Bee. Representing Yes on 30, and they can introduce themselves as well, but I'll just do it briefly here, are Bill McGavern with the Coalition for Clean Air and Tim Edwards with CAL FIRE, Local 2881. Representing No on 30 are Lauren Kay of Cal Chamber and Anamata Santos, a former secretary in the governor's cabinet. We'll start with 4-minute presentations from each side, and let's hear from Yes on 30 first. That would be Mr. McGavern and Mr. Edwards. Take it away.
I guess I'll start. My name is Tim Edwards, president of CAL FIRE Local 2881. And the reason why CAL FIRE Local 2881 is involved is because what this initiative does is it brings funding towards staffing and prevention of wildfires. And I would debate anybody that I believe wildfires are probably becoming the most pollutant part of our air in California these days. At the end of the last 4 or 5 years, the mega fires that we have had put toxic fumes into the air and burnt many acres of vegetation and trees that are supposed to help filter our air at the same time, but then burnt homes and cars and vehicles and pesticides and all the stuff that's in those houses that are going up into the air. And the staffing that over the last few years has been addressed in some way, shape, or form out of the general fund, but the general fund does not support the funding necessary to meet the goals of what we need the staff to prevent wildfires and then to initial attack of wildfires. So what we got involved with is this money will help dedicate money to go to the prevention and initial attack and training and to stop wildfires, which is becoming like the major factor of air pollution. Whether you're in San Francisco, San Diego, Sacramento, we've all been inundated with the smoke that we all breathe in, which then affects the healthcare facilities because then they take in people that are having lung problems, asthmas, and stuff like that. We're also involved because we're looking out for the health and safety of our firefighters who are spending multiple days in that same toxic smoke. So if we can jump on a fire quicker, help prevent it from starting, we think it doesn't only help the air pollution within California, but it protects the lives of firefighters. And I'll end right there for now.
Bill, do you want to use the rest of your time?
Yes, thanks very much. I'm Bill McGavern. I'm policy director with the Coalition for Clean Air. And as Tim indicated, Californians are painfully aware of the impacts of air pollution and wildfires and climate change in our state. In addition to wildfires, we have air pollution that kills thousands of Californians every year. We have extreme heat, as we're witnessing right now. We have an extreme drought. And so we know we need to do more. What Prop 30 does is to harness a very progressive revenue mechanism, taxing only incomes of over $2 million a year to raise money for existing proven programs to clean up our air and fight wildfires. In the transportation sector, transportation is responsible for about 80% of California's air pollution and about 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Fortunately, we have a solution, which is to electrify transportation. And the state has taken a number of steps to make that happen, but we need to hasten that transition. And we especially need to help Californians of modest means to make that transition to clean transportation. This measure would dedicate 80% of the funds to clean transportation through both vehicle and infrastructure funding. And at least half of that money has to go to disadvantaged and low-income communities. It goes to the agencies that are experienced already in distributing funding, and it would allow for the money to be spent not only on cars, but also trucks, buses, off-road equipment, which are responsible for the vast majority of the toxic diesel exhaust that's afflicting our communities, And also go for non-car programs like protected bike lanes and bike sharing and electric bikes and rapid transit. So for all of these reasons, we need Proposition 30.
Very good. Let's look to Lauren and Anna, if you would like to give your presentation. 4 minutes.
Hi, Anna Matos Santos here. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be with you today. The question of before us is not whether or not climate change is an urgent crisis that requires massive action. We all know that we need to do more to be able to fight climate change, that we need to do more to prepare Californians to be in a better position to face the challenges before us. That is why the governor and the legislature have made a historic investment in mitigating and addressing climate change, with just $54 billion invested in this area in the next 5 years just last week. It is why the governor and the legislature have taken huge action to accelerate our goals, to increase our ambition, to take on all of the things that we have to do to be able to make sure that we are both addressing the immediate impacts, including the heat events that we're facing, as well as taking action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and do it in a way that works for our economy and that works for our society. The issue before us is not that. It's how to pay for it, and whether we think it makes sense for Californians to have a special interest measure that provides the bulk of the funding of an increased tax revenue to help address what is the regulatory requirements and the obligations that are already faced by its primary sponsor. Should we have a tax that bypasses schools, that bypasses the legislature, that is being raised for a purpose of being able to fund only the regulatory compliance there and not the other components? I think in terms of other components is looking at what does this mean, and what does making an increase of this magnitude for this duration without recognizing other competing needs. Clearly, the state recognizes this as a priority. That is why those investments have been made. There's a long record of the legislature of investing existing resources beyond the general fund to be able to support this transition. And an important element of the priority that the legislature and the governor have brought to this is actual direct support for low-income drivers to be able to purchase cars, and looking at all of the different elements that we think are going to help us in this transition. In addition to the $10 billion that has been provided for the transition to clean vehicles and the standards that have just been adopted a few years ago to accelerate our transition, the state has made unprecedented commitments in public transit and in other elements to be able to do that. The state has done that looking at all of the other priorities and ensuring that the plan to support this transition and accelerate this transition is happening in a way that aligns with the needs of schools, with the needs of for healthcare, and with other priorities that the government is responsible for addressing. I will yield the rest of my time to my colleague, Lauren.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to speak to your board today. I'm Lauren Kay with California Chamber of Commerce. We oppose this measure. We're frankly baffled as to why the measure is on the ballot in the first place. It is basically, this measure is doing everything that the governor and the legislature are doing in this subject area, only they're doing it worse. They are using a revenue source which is flawed, is volatile, and will. Bill, could you turn off your mic? That's flawed and volatile and will come back and bite them in the long run when the economy turns. It's a very dangerous way to pay for a new program which is unnecessary, and we'll get back to that a little later.
Okay, very good. Bill and Tim, would you have a minute that you would like to take to kind of rebut what's been said?
Sure. The opposition's arguments in the ballot argument were labeled false and misleading by a Sacramento judge who took the extraordinary step of actually changing some of the language in their argument. So it's not my opinion that they're being false and misleading. That's what the judge said.
That is
So
not
this-
true.
This
I
idea
have
that
to
there's some
step in.
kind of, this is our time, and it is true, and I can send you the opinion where she said that. The idea that this is a special interest provision is ridiculous. There's absolutely nothing in this measure that benefits any company. If there were, they would tell you what that provision is, but there is no such provision, and that's why they're not pointing to one. Cleaning up transportation is going to be good for all of us. Sure, it'll be good for Lyft, and it'll be good for the whole state. And if some of their low-income drivers can get into electric vehicles because of this measure, that'll be great for all of us.
Okay, no on 30. I bet you have something to say about that since you tried to jump in and say it already. Please take another minute.
I
and,
apologize for jumping in, but the
sorry.
changes in the
I'm
ballot
sorry.
argument were from
I'm
would to
sorry.
could. So
I'm
I
sorry,
just want to
Garth.
clarify that.
I'm
We'd be happy to
I'm
send that
sorry,
over.
Garth. I'm sorry, Garth. How many people are allowed to speak here? Because if it's just the proponents and the opponents and two of
yeah,
each,
thank you.
then
Thank
those
you
are the
for-
rules.
Thank
I'll
you
step
for
in and-
pointing that out. I'm going to ask Deborah and Amelia to let the presenters talk. We do have a rule that the four presenters will be the ones to speak. Let's start the clock, Maria, when it's time for Anna and Lauren to respond, please.
Yeah, I'll just say briefly that was kind of a silly point that Bill made about the judge. Judge basically changed a couple of words, basically from would to could. We said that in our ballot arguments, we said, and I feel very confident about this, that this measure would require a doubling of the state grid to be able to accommodate all vehicles. The California Energy Commission, in fact, said it would require a tripling of the state grid. The judge basically said, don't use the word would, use the word could. That was the change.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to ask yes on 30 if they dispute that, because it looked to me like they might. Bill?
So this is a direct quote from the judge's opinion. Several statements in the argument against Proposition 30 are false and or misleading. They're being false, they're being misleading. And the argument about the grid is ridiculous. The state estimates that to have 5 million plug-in vehicles in 2030 would require peak demand going up by 1%. 1%. We can handle that easily.
All right, let's ask Anna and Lauren if they have a quick response to that.
Garth, I can't hear your question.
Do you have a quick response to that, what Bill just said, Lauren or Anna?
I think top line, we addressed the issues before us. The question here is whether it makes sense for all of Californians. You know, the bulk of the revenue to fund this initiative comes to a single corporation that is facing an obligation to be able to transition to clean energy, an obligation that is needed. Hence, it was adopted by the legislature to transition to clean cars sooner. The rationale for requiring that obligation of these companies is because of the direct increases in greenhouse gas emissions that have been documented associated with these companies, and an interest in having that be phased out with an earlier transition for electric vehicles. Broadly, the question here is, you know, should there be taxpayer resources that are raised for that, or should regulatory costs be borne by the entity that is supporting? You know, more broadly, I think in terms of at the moment that the state is coming together to figure out how to make sure that we can keep the power on and avoid avoid emergency grid outcomes, to hand wave significant increases on demand.
Thank
I
you,
think is a
Anna.
little problematic.
I think I was just asking if you had a response to what they were talking about with the judge. But you know, I'm sure you're right. That's getting a little bit into the weeds. This again is meant to be for the voters. So let's start asking some questions from those on the editorial boards of McClatchy Newspapers. I'll start with the first question. This one is for the yes on 30 people. You know, aren't you a little disheartened that the governor, who is such a progressive governor, doesn't like this?
Well, it's disappointing. If you look at the arguments that he made, they don't hold up. He said that this was a special interest measure, and yet it funds the very same programs that he funds through his budget. So those programs somehow are fine when he funds them, but they're special interests if they're funded through a ballot measure. That's ridiculous. And then he talked about diverting money that could be used for other purposes like education and healthcare. So let's be absolutely clear. This is money that otherwise would just remain in the pockets of California's wealthiest people, the 35,000 wealthiest households. They're the only ones who would be taxed by this. And this is not money that would go to any other public purpose. It would just stay with those ultra rich people who are the ones who are funding the opposition.
Okay. I wonder, you know, if Lauren or Anna would have a response just to that, or should we move on to another question?
I'm happy
I
to,
don't. Go ahead.
if it's helpful, I'm happy to speak to it. And I think again, I think when we're looking at this measure and looking at what the measure does, it increases taxes for one particular purpose that has a big significant impact on assisting a single entity in being able to meet regulatory compliance. It bypasses the state legislature. It bypasses the overall process where the state looks at how best to meet all needs, and it takes a resource off the table in the context of potential future downturn. So as you look at these different elements, this basically says this tax for this particular purposes, without critical elements like guaranteeing that resources go directly to help low-income Californians be able to be part of this transition through things like significant investments in transit or significant investments in their ability to be able to purchase vehicles.
Okay, great. Stephanie, let's turn to you for a question, please.
Sure, thank you. I will admit I'm somewhat skeptical about the grid being able to handle a huge influx of EVs based in part on what we've seen this week. Well, when electric vehicle owners were asked not to charge. I'm kind of wondering why none of this would go toward, for example, rooftop solar or battery storage for low-income households, because it almost seems like we're putting the cart before the horse here.
So I'm happy to respond to that. Actually, EV owners were not asked not to charge. They were asked to charge off peak. Some of us who own EVs, that's only when we charge. I only charge off peak. It's very simple to do. I charged last night. It's actually good for the grid when we even
yes, I understand that, but nonetheless, there was not enough power available for everybody to be charging their EVs.
There was last night. Yeah, from midnight until noon today.
Okay, I'm not going to argue about it with you.
There was no grid entity that was asking us not to charge between midnight and noon today. It was not a problem at all.
Well, between midnight and noon. That's say 6 p.m. It was my understanding we weren't supposed to charge.
But that's, you know, people should be charging off peak. A lot of us, that's the only time when we do charge, and we get lower rates for doing that.
Well, sometimes there's an emergency. I too have an EV. Sometimes there's an emergency when you have to charge, right?
And sometimes we have emergency when we'll be very happy that we have batteries in our vehicles that we can use to charge our homes.
Can we get back to the question, please?
Yeah.
Why no funding for, say, rooftop solar or battery storage?
Oh, sure. Because as I said in the opening, the vast majority of California's air pollution and about half of its climate pollution comes from transportation. Wildfires are the most devastating impact that we've seen from climate change. So we're addressing the biggest problems that have the biggest needs.
Okay.
I think we'll turn to Tad Weber in Fresno. Would you have a question for us, Tad?
Yes, thank you, Garth. I want to address this question to the opponents of the measure. So living here in Fresno, unfortunately, I live in the part of the state that has acute problems with air pollution. In fact, Cal EnviroScreen has found several of the zip codes here in the Fresno area to be the most polluted places in California. So my question is, it seems that any ability to reduce air pollution is a positive win for California overall. Why shouldn't we be reducing air pollution regardless of how that is accomplished?
Well, I don't think you have a more aggressive agency in all of America than the State Air Resources Board when it comes to reducing air pollution. I don't think you have a more committed governor in the country than Gavin Newsom when it comes to reducing air pollution and addressing climate change and the contributors to climate change. I don't know how you can responsibly ask any more than what you've got there. But instead, what you have with this ballot measure, it's not a good idea to do everything if what you're doing is irresponsible. And this ballot measure is irresponsible because it funds the program with a volatile and potentially dangerous revenue source, and it so rapidly ramps up the demand that it could threaten the grid. So I think that Fresno is in relatively good hands with the Air Resources Board and the governor, but would not be well served by a measure like this.
Garth, let me follow up with Mr. K on one point you just raised. Mr. K, when you reference a volatile revenue source, what I'm assuming you're referencing is the income taxes that payers would be paying into this. Is that correct?
That's right.
Thank you. Here's a question for the yes people again. I've seen several editorials that have been written by newspapers that oppose this measure, you know, kudos to the No on 30 people for rounding it up in a nice way and on their website. I don't see any supporting yes on 30. Are there some? Or have we missed it? Which newspapers like us, you know, support yes on 30?
I guess this is your chance to be the first. I love newspapers. I think, to be honest with you, a lot of the big ones haven't weighed in yet.
Okay. Stephanie, let's have a question from you.
Okay. I'm curious as to how you came up with a formula of 80% versus 20%. You're muted.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't think it's a magic number. It is interesting that the 80% for transportation does match the share of California's key air pollutants that come from transportation. So I think, you know, there's really an appropriateness to that number. And by the way, we have by far the worst air pollution in the entire country, and we're not in any way on track to actually having our air even be legal. Our air is so dirty, it's illegal under federal and state law.
Okay.
So there is a guarantee that at least half of this would be reserved for low and middle income people who really need some help. Is that what it is, Bill? I think I understood that.
Yes,
I guess
that's
I'm-
written into both the vehicle and the infrastructure sections. Yes.
I guess I would turn to the other side and say, why oppose something that would help? I mean, I guess just in the people who are in this cause, journalists still make a lot of money. And there's a lot of people who are really struggling out there. Why not give them a hand in acquiring these electric vehicles and zero emission vehicles that everyone's going to need in a few years?
Hey, Bill, do you mind hitting mute? Thank you. Sorry, just a lot of feedback. I think it's a huge priority to provide additional support for low-income people to be able to purchase vehicles. It's why it was a critical component of the $10 billion package done by the governor and the legislature. And it's important to note that this measure does not guarantee funding for low-income people to be able to purchase vehicles. It does provide funding for infrastructure in low-income communities, but that infrastructure can be used by many people, not necessarily low-income people. Second piece is we know that while it's very important to provide support for low-income Californians, as has been done in the budget, to be able to purchase vehicles, both used and new, that it is really important to also ensure that we're doing things like public transit and other elements that are also supported in the budget package that are more accessible to a broader array of Californians. One of the reasons that it was really important and has been for over the last decade to be able to provide additional support for the purchase of electric vehicles is because of the price differentials between electric vehicles and other vehicles. At this juncture, that price differential is shrinking. So I think, again, these are questions that are best addressed when looking at all the issues. And I just wanted to say, Stephanie, I agree that hand waving the impacts on the grid is not only disappointing, but it's irresponsible.
Let's go to Tad. You have a question for us? Oh, I don't see him anymore. Did he leave? That's okay. How come the no on 30 people haven't said anything about the about Lyft, or have you said something about Lyft? I want to know more about why that one company has spent so much money on this.
I think the company's in the best position to be able to speak to that. But I can tell you from what they say in their public documents, and I can tell you in their filings with SEC and others, as well as with what is currently happening. Lyft, Uber, and other TNCs have generated a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. It was why there was legislation that looked at the impact that they're having and establish a goal to require that by 2030, 5 years ahead of the overall goal, these companies have to switch to electric vehicles. Lyft has publicly talked about the interest in accessing and securing taxpayer funding so that the regulatory costs that they have to face to deal with the impact that they're having on the environment today are funded by taxpayers and not directly funded by as regulatory costs normally are by the entity themselves. They're best positioned to talk about what they've done it, but I'm talking about public documents. They do talk about this deliberate strategy.
Did you want to say anything about that, the other side?
Sure. I helped Senator Skinner pass the bill to require the ride-hailing companies to reduce their emissions, and then spent a couple of years at the Air Resources Board getting them to pass a stronger regulation than had initially been proposed. So yes, absolutely, we want to clean up the ride-hailing sector. This measure would help to do that. That's a very small piece of what it would do. In fact, ride-hailing vehicles are responsible for about 1% of the vehicle miles traveled in the state. So yeah, we got to go after those, but we need to clean up the whole transportation system. And kudos to Lyft for recognizing that we need to do that and for stepping forward with a very responsible solution. And it's only the very wealthy and their allies they're opposing it because their taxes would go up a little bit, 1.7% after the first 2 million. These are people who can afford to pay that, and they should pay that for the good of all of us who breathe the air in this state.
I understand that 1.7, you know, that doesn't sound like a lot, but we already have, do we not, the highest income tax in the nation, the highest sales tax, the highest road tax, or about it. I'm just wondering, you know, isn't there a point where you just are the cost of business is so high that isn't there a threat of losing some of these people to other states?
Well, the data actually don't support that. So the last income tax increase on the wealthy done by Governor Brown, who, by the way, also bypassed the legislature. I think Anna was working for him at the time. He said he would only do it by bypassing the legislature and going right to the ballot. Since that measure passed and income taxes on the wealthy went up, the number of high earners in the state has actually burgeoned. So no, I don't think it's a danger that if you tax the very wealthy, that there will be negative consequences. I think it's good for all of us.
Well,
Anything to say?
yeah,
ahead,
yeah.
Lauren.
I mean, I think that's whistling past the graveyard. The wealthy individuals have there's really two things. Wealthy individuals have a lot of options as to where they invest their money. It's more than just do they live here or don't live here. It's where they invest their money and get their returns, and what is the best way for them to put their money. But I think more important than the wealthy as individual taxpayers is what happens when there's a downturn. I mean, we may be heading into a recession in the next few months. You know, it's hard to tell, but we may be. And if it's not in the next few months, there will be a downturn in the business cycle. And at that point, we've seen again and again that our revenues go down disproportionate to the downturn of the economy because of the way the taxes are designed. And you get yourself into a situation where you make commitments with this money, and the taxes aren't there, and then you're in a world of hurt. So that's one of the reasons this is an irresponsible measure.
I want to hear from Tim again. I want to have a better understanding of how this helps the firefighting effort. I mean, it almost looks like we could spend the entire state budget on wildfires and we'd still have wildfires. I mean, it's getting to that point where there's just so many and it's so bad. So what does this do specifically to help in that regard?
Well, what this does is it creates an actual funding source. Right now, our staffing is competing out of the general fund, and everybody is grabbing from that general fund for all these other projects that take priority. So I'm not going to badmouth the administration or anything like that, because they have made strides into doing something for prevention in initial attack. The problem is their hands are tied because we're competing with general fund money. And that general fund money is being spent everywhere else. So what little portion that we get does not do enough to address the staffing issues that we need or the prevention side of what we do. So what this money does is directly give money directly to CAL FIRE for prevention and suppression of wildfires. You're right. Wildfires are here. They're here to stay. They're not going away. But if we can prevent as many from starting and jump on them as fast as we can prevent the mega fires that are causing the toxic chemicals going into our air. That's why we're involved. We don't have a revenue source in the state of California. This creates a revenue source to help bring that staffing and prevention to CAL FIRE.
Okay, good enough. Stephanie, do you have any other questions, or should we move to the closing
I'm
portion?
good. Yeah.
Well, let's go ahead and do that then. I'm going to ask both sides to take about 1 minute and give a closing statement, and then we'll wrap it up. Sure, appreciate everyone being here, and well, I'll say more about that later. But let's start with yes on 30. I'm sorry, no on 30. We'll reverse the order, and no on 30. Take about a minute to tell us why this measure is a bad idea.
Well, I'll jump in. You've spent the last 45 minutes hearing about why it's bad, so I don't need to really prepare ourselves. We have an unnecessary tax that's funding a program that has already been aggressively funded by the governor and the legislature. The proposal is irresponsible because it's going to put demands on the grid that could be unsustainable. And I'd like to also just point out on behalf of the governor that I would be astonished if he hasn't given CAL FIRE everything that they've needed. I would be astonished if there's any money left on the table for CAL FIRE. So I think that's that's probably a red herring as well. They are very highly staffed. So it's an irresponsible measure, irresponsibly funded, and we should leave this to the governor and the legislature.
Thank you. Let's hear from yes on 30 for your final closing statement.
I'd like to just really quick comment on what he said. He's not inaccurate. The governor has put everything on the table with what he had out of the general fund. CAL FIRE is not staffed to the needs that meet today's wildfires. We have been understaffed for multiple years, and we have not met that need. We do not have the resources to meet today because the general fund is not supporting of it. So I do not disagree that the governor has laid everything he can on the table with the funding that he has. Very limited funding. This gives funding to meet the needs. No, CAL FIRE is not staffed appropriately.
And the situation is actually similar on the transportation side. There are existing programs that would be funded by this measure, but they don't have enough money. They're very popular and they run out every year. So we don't have enough clean trucks, buses, and cars funded. And Prop 30 would provide that money through a reliable and progressive revenue stream. Thanks.
All right. Well, very good. This concludes McClatchy Newspapers Joint Editorial Board Forum on Proposition 30. We appreciate these representatives taking the time to explain their positions on this important initiative for our viewers. Thank you, everyone, and good day.